they've chosen to focus on a completely different set of issues. For example, let's look at the recent reckless tax and spending bill. Our Democratic colleagues, although we have worked together constructively on bipartisan legislation, in this case decided to pass a partisan bill to spend $740 billion strictly along partisan lines. But all this money and the tax increases that go along with it won't address the biggest problems families are facing anytime soon, certainly. In fact, it's likely to make the problems even worse. At a time when many people are struggling to pay for gasoline for their cars, our Democratic colleagues decided to give well-to-do people who can afford $80,000 electric vehicles a taxpayer handout of about $7,500 at the expense of the working families who can't afford to buy an electric vehicle of their own at any price. This ensures that gas prices will climb even higher by reviving this bill will revive the old Superfund tax on American energy production. It'll guarantee families will face higher electricity prices this winter by slapping a new methane tax on energy producers. And that's all just the climate portion of the reckless tax and spending bill. Our colleagues decided that it was the smart thing to do to supersize the Internal Revenue Service and giving it even more manpower to invariably audit middle-class America and small businesses. And then they've doled massive handouts to some of their key constituencies, like labor unions. They've chosen to impose socialist price controls on prescription drugs, which will stifle medical innovation and prevent new life-saving cures from being discovered. And perhaps worst of all, they raise taxes on the middle class. I know President Biden promised time and time again to never raise taxes on anyone earning less than $400,000 a year. And our Democratic colleagues still claim that this bill makes good on that promise. But that's simply not consistent with the facts. It's not true. The Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation has confirmed it. The JCT found that taxpayers making far less than $400,000 at some point get walloped by higher taxes. That includes people making between $30,000 and $40,000 a year. You can read it yourself, the distributional tables at the Joint Committee on Taxation website. We know that inflation is outpacing wage growth, which means that workers already are receiving a silent pay cut or silent tax thanks to overspending here on things that frankly are not priorities. And many of those same workers are going to pay even more in federal taxes. But perhaps the most insulting part of this reckless tax and spending bill that our Democratic colleagues decided to pass unilaterally was they chose to call it the Inflation Reduction Act. Leading economic experts say this bill won't do a thing to address inflation, certainly in the near term. In fact, over the next couple of years, they predict inflation is likely to get slightly worse. But that's how things work in this parallel universe known as Washington, D.C. Democrats see that families are being battered by inflation, but they don't actually pass legislation that will help. Our colleagues just want to use the plight to come up with a sympathetic title for a radical partisan bill. And they're happy to stick middle-class Americans with the check. The icing on the cake came a couple of weeks ago after this bill became law when President Biden made an executive decision to cancel $500 billion in student loans. Any family knows you can't just cancel debt. There's no magic wand that will make it disappear. Every dollar that was borrowed will eventually have to be paid back by someone, but President Biden has just shifted the burden of who that someone will be. Now the middle class taxpayers are on the hook yet once again. Under President Biden's proposal, it doesn't matter if a person took out loans and repaid them already, in other words, did what they said they would do by repaying the money that they had borrowed. Whether they worked their way through school, whether they held 2 or 3 jobs, or chose not to attend college at all, their tax dollars will pay for someone else's college debt. My point, Mr. President, is there is a remarkable divide between what Washington Democrats are trying to accomplish and the problems middle-class families are actually facing. Families are struggling to put food on the table, and our Democratic colleagues are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on climate initiatives. This reminds me of a few years ago, a social movement by the so-called Yellow Jackets, a mosaic of French working class people who felt disenfranchised from the urban elite, who, as they said, can focus on the end of the world while we're worrying about the end of the month. That's what average working families in Texas and across the country are concerned about. How do we get to the end of the month with enough money to put food on the table and gas in the tank? Workers can't afford a full tank of gas, and Democrats are forcing them to subsidize electric vehicles for the wealthy. People are worried about how much their electricity bills will cost this winter, and Democrats imposed a new tax that will send those costs even higher. These policies aren't going to make life better for the middle class anytime soon. They aren't going to help families or businesses that are trying to create jobs and opportunities for their communities, and it certainly isn't going to bring our economy roaring back to life. The fact of the matter is, since our Democrats took control of the government more than a year and a half ago, Texans' lives have gotten harder, not easier. Inflation has skyrocketed, wages have fallen, our economy fell into a recession, and the border's on fire. And our colleagues, certainly the Biden administration, doesn't seem to care. In fact, they seem to block out the concerns of middle-class Americans so they can pursue an ideological agenda like there's no tomorrow. When I'm home in Texas, folks talk about the problems workers and families are facing every day. They don't want to send taxpayer handouts to wealthy people buying electric vehicles, or help subsidize labor unions, or pay off someone else's loans. The sooner our Democratic colleagues realize that, the better off we will all be. But then again, maybe it's going to take an election this November.